no way that's not going to crash at some point.
Yeah, we'll see. So I do want to mention I'm recording right now. So I'm recording the screen and I'm recording the audio. So don't say anything that you don't want heard on the internet. I figure it's Valentine's Day, so I try to do a little bit of this and see if I can share with the people who are at home with their better halves. So I had a small talk a couple months back, and I was talking about this experiment that I was going to try, where I wanted to, from the ground up, build a web framework in Ruby in more of a classic MVC sort of way, and not necessarily to. I explicitly did not want to publish a gem or, try and share it or push it, but more from an academic standpoint and say, if we did this all from scratch, how would we want some of these things to look? So the goals that I started out with, of course, were not the goals that I finished up with, but I'm happy to say I was very agile while I was working on this and continuously pivoted my strategy. And so at the end, I have this sort of retrospective, is probably the best thing that I could call it. I put all the code that I was working on, including this presentation, online at this URL. The code isn't exactly in line with the presentation code. There were earlier versions that I played with. There's some that's a little bit more pseudocode that I didn't get a chance to implement. But for the most part, I think it represents what I was trying to do. Okay. And also, I would, just like with gyms, I love it when we have a presentation that's more of a discussion. So I'd love it if you ask questions, and bear with me while I repeat and parrot them back to you, because I'm a little closer to the mic. Let me get this mouse out of the way. So traditional MVC, the real model view controller stuff, and I went back to a pretty old document here from, I think, '86. And I was looking at, what does a view really do? What's a view's responsibilities? And the core tasks of a view are to manage the output. They're supposed to be nested. That was actually one of the first requirements of views back with Smalltalk MVC, was that they wanted to nest lots of them. They wanted to reflect changes on the model, and they want the view to actually trigger controller actions that would be propagated to the rest of the system. The controller's job was to interpret the user input, then command models and views throughout the application, or at least under its control, to change in some way. And that controllers would always be one-to-one with views. So there'd always be one controller per view. If you make a sub-nested view, it has its own controller to handle its events, its methods, and its associations. And controllers are supposed to communicate with other controllers. So when you click the button view tells the button view's controller, hey, this button was clicked. Then that controller tells a different controller maybe to refresh something or destroy something, right? So you have a whole bunch of these controller collaborators. Then the model, this is pretty much in line with how we think of them, where they manage behavior and data, respond to requests about their state, like are you active, are you not active, when were you made, that sort of thing. And that's from the view to represent it. And then respond to instructions for changing state from the controller, and that's like publish or save, destroy, update, that sort of stuff. So there's another pattern called Model 2, and this came out a bit later for use in Java web applications specifically. It's a controller and view pattern, and the model is explicitly left open for you to do with as you please, mix in whatever model you'd like to be using with it. In Model 2, a controller interprets a request from a user over HTTP usually. It's going to perform a bunch of logic. It's going to take the results of that logic, pass it to a view, and then the view is going to represent it somehow, and then the controller is responsible for returning the view's output back to the user. And the view just receives the input from the controller, then renders it somehow and returns it once. And like I said, the model is just kind of whatever, and it's there to help controllers out. So in Rails, Model 2 is a lot more applicable to what we do. We kind of have these single pass sort of requests. They're not long-lived like a GUI might be, where you're kind of clicking and playing with a whole bunch of things like a client-side JavaScript framework or a real GUI graphical framework. And so what I wanted to do is kind of compare how does Rails stack up when we compare it to Model 2 and traditional MVC. So Rails controllers, they interpret requests like Model 2, and I guess you could call that handling user input in the form of MVC, because the user's kind of saying, I want to do this thing, right? But they're only doing this one input. They perform logic, just like Model 2, and they do command the models like MVC. So that still makes sense. They pass information to the view. They're not really commanding the view to change like MVC. I mean, they kind of are, but they're mostly just asking it to render. Controllers also, they return the view's output. That's very Model 2 style. Traditional MVC controllers don't return view output. Views output themselves. They're not one-to-one with views. So that's not like traditional MVC. In Rails, we've got the one controller, then the view has a layout and subviews called partials keep rendering each other. And it definitely doesn't communicate with other controllers. I mean, the most we do is tell the client to go see another controller with a redirect, but that's kind of passing the buck. It's not like we're asking a different controller what it thinks about a certain state or where it's at or what its results might be. So the comparison between the views, they receive input from the controller like Model 2. They render output like Model 2 and like MVC, because MVC views are responsible for displaying themselves. They're kind of designed to be nested. Partials kind of are, except that we love to jam instance variables into views, and then partials don't really nest that well. So they're really more like macros than like objects. And if you've ever, anyone here, I'm sure, at one point when they were first learning Rails was like, oh, this would be great if I had a layout and then a sub-layout that I could switch out and then a view. And everyone tries to make multiple layout levels. So they could say, okay, first render this layout, then yield this inner layout. So you have the main page, then you have the admin mode layout inside, and then you have the list mode. And you just can't nest layouts in Rails. You have to do them as this crazy sort of partial calling thing, and it's just weird. It's not worth it. Views do not trigger controller actions like MVC. There's no feedback flow from the view up to the controller, except for, I guess, kind of helper methods sort of count, except that stuff is, I don't know, it can get weird, and it's definitely not commonplace. What's up? You're giving me a stare.
Yeah, no, it's there. I'm just
okay.
Really all it is that, but the view hasn't even been rendered yet. I mean, it's all taking place on a server. The action is about to take place on a client across the wire, right? So how could the
Well,
view,
we're talking about the whole request cycle. So the request comes in, the controller sends stuff to the view.
right?
When the control is in the view's hands, when the view is executing its stuff, it's rendering, but it's not calling methods back on the controller to do something, right? Sometimes you have controller methods, but they're almost always helpers for extra information to pass into the view. You don't usually have the view say, oh, by the way, controller, redirect, please. Like that doesn't make sense in the context of Rails. And that's why Rails is more like Model 2 than traditional MVC. Because traditional MVC, the applications are longer lived. It's not just like there's a request cycle where everything gets trashed. Does that make sense? So, yeah, like I was saying, they don't change over time. I hit the last bullet point. So as far as models are concerned in Rails, it's pretty much the same stuff. They manage the behavior and data. They respond to requests about state. They respond to instructions to change state, and it's whatever you really need it to be. And recently, which has been great, in the past year or so, people are starting to make more models than just active record models, and I love seeing that. And like I think the DCI stuff that we were talking about earlier, making more models to represent more interactions and more objects than just the number of tables in your database is really helpful, and I think we're really getting that right now, which is great. So Rails, MVC, and Model 2, it's kind of a hybrid, but there's no feedback. It's kind of like a one-way shot through the system because it's very rack-like. There's this one-way shot, it's calling all the way down and then returning strings all the way back. And that's just the nature of the web. Okay, big text slide. Another classic document. And this is talking about the difference between a framework and a library. And So one of the important characteristics is that the methods defined by the user to tailor the framework will often be called from within the framework itself, meaning that the framework is going to call code that it expects you to implement, and the framework is managing the environment for you and then asking you what you would like to do in a certain situation. For example, the Rails router says, here's a route to Rails. Then Rails gets the request, Rails figures out what route it is, then it goes and looks at your table and says, oh, he wanted me to send you to this controller. Goes over to that controller and says, you better have an action that's named the same thing as that, and calls it, right? So Rails is very much calling your code through the router, through the controller. So this inversion of control gives frameworks the power to serve as extensible skeletons, meaning we can extend Rails, we can mess with Rails, we can merge, include all these gems into Rails, make it more powerful, and we can grow it separately from our application itself, and you can enhance Rails without having to change your own code, because Rails is in charge here, and it has that high-level control. And so the inversion of control they're talking about is because usually when you write a program, you're the beginning and you're the end, and in the middle you call other helpful code. When you have a framework, the framework's the beginning and the end, and you fill the middle in. Does that make sense? Cool. So when you're dealing with a framework, like it says here, each method added to a subclass must abide by the internal conventions of its superclasses. That means that when you name methods in a controller, they have to be named after the action that they're serving. When you're using some active record or active model validations or error reporting, you need to use the specific sets of methods that they would like you to define in order to implement active model, for example. So if you use active model persistence, I think you have to implement save, and you have to implement a way of asking if it's persisted. So if you look at these components they've mixed out, they all have contracts that say, if you want to implement this thing, you got to do this stuff. Like the simplest one in Ruby is enumerable. If you want to implement enumerable, you have to define each. Once you define each, you get all that great enumerable stuff. So the last thing they mentioned here is that they call them white box frameworks because their implementation must be understood to use them. So you have to know how active model persistence is going to work to implement the right methods to be able to use active model, right? So by white box, they mean that you have to be able to see inside the box in order to work with the box. A framework becomes more reusable as the relationship between its parts is defined in terms of a protocol instead of using inheritance. And this is like 1986, right? I think this is hugely related to the talk about DCI, where we're talking about defining a protocol between objects instead of talking about the inheritance from other master objects, right? So what this is kind of getting at is a little bit towards Ruby's duck typing, meaning that as long as something behaves kind of like a model, Rails can treat it kind of like a model, right? And that if you have to inherit from something and override a bunch of things, you're kind of stuck in that object's way of thinking. But if all you have to do is implement an interface and then speak to other objects using that protocol, you get a more reusable framework. So they call these black box relationships because you don't need to see inside the box to be able to interact with the box. So between white box, where you have to know what's going on and implement specific methods, and black box, where you don't need to know what's going on and you just have to work with the protocol, now I get to quiz the class and ask you, what do you think rack is? Is that white box or black box?
White box.
White box?
Black box.
Black box? Fight.
Oh,
So
You interface with through a protocol. Like
you do.
it
The
doesn't-
protocol is call, which takes the environment, and it returns the status headers and the content. And you do have to implement this method, right? But you don't need to inherit from a rack object and be able to interact with rack-like components. You just need to behave like one and speak with this call-based protocol. So I kind of gave this one away, right? But active record, that's an example of a white box. You have to use active record via inheritance. That's how it works. You need to know the internal conventions, like the filters and stuff, to be able to use active record, or callbacks, I meant. You have to work with things like save and find, which are all these internal methods that are core to the way that active record works. Action controller, right? Go for it.
Black box.
Black box.
Mixture of the two.
A mixture of the two. I'm still not sure about this, so maybe I'm wrong, right? I think action controller is white box. It's based on inheritance, and you do need to understand the internal conventions because you have to define your actions specific to the way the router works with them. And when you're working with filters, you have to understand how the filters are going to work. What is the protocol for action controller? How do you instantiate one? How do you call a method on one? What are the return values? What's this method signature that action controller has? I have no idea because I've never actually used action controller like that. I'm always inside. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Couldn't you, in the route, couldn't you define your own, like instead of create, instead of like show or whatnot, like couldn't you define your own method you're calling that? Like if you wanted to create convention, couldn't you customize that?
If you wanted to create a convention in the routes file,
Sorry, if you want to name your own action instead of using the conventions.
oh right, you can name your own actions whatever you want,
Yeah.
but when you name them something, I'm just saying like you have to, whatever you name them in the routes is what they have to be named in the controller,
okay.
right?
And because of
Now,
that,
imagine if the router was like rack. You could give it any object, and as long as it spoke with call,
Yeah.
you have to name the action call, right? But now it's a protocol, and
So
I mean,
because they're connected.
yeah.
Sorry, an action controller is a black box when you specify it as a resource. Because then all you have to do is implement a set of methods, right?
Well, then you have to know exactly how it works. You have to know how
You only know
resources
you have,
work.
No, you need to know the interface. You need to know I have to implement these 5 methods.
That's true. Yeah. I see what you
And-
mean,
and
right?
your hook-
There's index,
Absolutely.
show,
Your hook
update,
in
whatever.
is via your inheritance, which is kind of interesting. But then you also have to register with the framework to say, hey,
Yeah.
by the way.
Yeah, I think it is a
rack-
hybrid.
Rack, you have to do the same thing, right? Just merely by implementing the interface is not enough. You have to register it with the framework in order for it to say, yeah, here I'm presenting myself as an implementation of this, call me. The mere implement, so there's the how do you get yourself registered within the framework, which one way is by inheritance. The other way would be the framework goes out and introspects somehow, which is it's kind of interesting.
So a question that I thought about a lot while I was thinking about this that I'll pose to you to make you think about it in sort of a similar way. How would I use a different controller in a Rails application? I want to write my own controller that's much cooler than Action Controller. How do I use it with Rails? As far as I could think of, there's no good way to go into the router and say, can you please call this other class for me and maybe abide by its conventions instead? Because there is so much convention in Rails, which is usually what we love about it, right? That it knows how to talk to its own routers. But if you were to make an alternative class to Action Controller and use it instead, there aren't those sorts of places to hook it in. But what you said where rack, to use rack, you have to register it with a framework at some point, right?
Yeah.
That's the point. You have to define some sort of relationship between your routes and your controllers in a rack-based framework, right? You have to actually say, when this route is matched, I want you to call that object and use call on it, right? Your code itself has to say, matching this thing, object.call, right? If you use something like Sinatra, you can say, okay, you match this route, now it just basically says, here, write code now, and at that point you say, okay, maybe I want to do rack in here, and so you could call something, right? Or you can invent your own thing, you can swap out your objects. So this is the point of what I'm talking about between framework and library, where a framework calls your stuff, and you don't get to really mess with how it works unless it exposes configuration elements to you. But a library, that real black box sort of thing, you have to control it. You are controlling the beginning and the end of the application, and you have to call everything yourself.
Have you attempted to see what you need to do if you don't inherit from action controller? You just make a controller class and
No, I didn't try. I figured there would be a lot of methods that Rails uses, but I'm not sure.
I'm really
it could be
curious.
pretty clean. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at here. Is like, what could we do to make action controller like rack? What's an interface we could trim it down to where other classes could implement it, and we could give Rails controllers that were just some type of controller object that implemented this protocol to make it more black box, right? Now, we were talking about cells earlier, which are a replacement for views that have their own code context as well as a templating context. And by replacing your views with cells, you get a bunch of these benefits. But in the controller, you have to do some weird stuff to let you actually hook a cell into a controller, because they gotta overwrite all of Rails trying to call action view. And so if we can make these components more black box, maybe they're more pluggable and we can build some cool alternatives. And I think that's like one of the biggest things that I've discovered working through this, and we'll see some of them later, is some of the ways that you can swap alternatives when you're given library style control over a framework. I'm going to move on because the stuff we're talking about here comes up more throughout the presentation, so we'll get to it more. All right, so last quiz question was, what about Mustache? Template library. Black box, yeah. And most template libraries, at least the good ones, right, are going to be black box because they have a protocol. In this case, there's a template and there's a context that the template works in, and you call render. Interestingly, the Ruby implementation is via inheritance and is more of a white box implementation. So I use Mustache, but I kind of like to call it with this second bullet here where you call render as opposed to inheriting from Mustache, just because then you can control the context. Although the Ruby implementation does make it really nice and clean and easy to get started. I mean, that's kind of the nice thing about a framework, is it picks a bunch of things for you, and it's a little simpler and cleaner as long as you want to do what it's there to do. So I explained it briefly at the beginning, but my quest here was to start from scratch with just rack, and then either use, like find and use, or make my own black box components to kind of scrap together a web framework that would hopefully be interesting and more object-oriented. So here are the components I ended up having for my system. There's a router, an action, a view, a template, a collection, and a model. And I'm going to go through each one of these. So for the router, I just decided to use Rack's URLMap. And so you can see the way I ended up having my, this is the top of my application. So I was making a blog, but I decided to call it blurg. And so in my rackup file, I'm just saying run a new blurg. So when you make a new blurg, you initialize it, it instantiates its router, and then whenever you call on the blurg instance, it will call on the router. So really, my application is really just a router with a special instantiation that defines my routes. And right here, for example's sake, I only have one route, which is that the root of the site renders the index. If you think of this in a Rails scope, it's the index action of the posts controller, which is a page. I use some namespacing here so I can use the same terms in multiple places. And this index object we'll get to in a minute, but because it implements rack, my router here can just say the root goes to this object and it's going to take care of everything. So pass it along. And in this case, I'm kind of using Rack's URLMap like a framework to call my own code. So yeah, I used an existing component, and it has a specific protocol, which means that the key is a string, the value is a rack object. Pretty simple protocol. I also could have used a whole bunch of other things. I could have used HTTP router, which is the router behind Mongrel, and it has a lot more stuff in it, like being able to do colon-style params like Rails. I could have used a white box router like Sinatra, where it, as a normal Sinatra file, had a bunch of these route objects, but then I called my own code from within them. So it's nice to be able to swap these components out. So a brief aside before I talk about pages, I want to talk about Rails controllers. Rails controllers have multiple actions, right? They're methods. Really, I feel like Rails controllers should be a namespace. And if the actions, instead of being methods, were classes, you could share behavior between those actions. For example, all destroys are inherently similar. Imagine if you were to take the DCI concept and apply it to just the destroy method, right? You could mix a destroyable module into a destroy action, and the destroyable would be mixed into the item that you wanted to destroy. So you find the post, you mix in destroyable, and then you just default to however a destroyable action works, which is to try and destroy the thing, and if it doesn't work, raise an error, and if it does work, send you back to a specific route, right? But since Rails controller actions are methods, you can't really do that very well. And what we ended up with was before filters, because you needed this special construct, this before filter, to be able to get something that's kind of like inheritance, but for methods. And I found that to be really backwards, and this was one of the things I wanted to try the most, which was to have these things called actions. When I started this, I thought, what's the highest level abstraction or highest level object that I can think of in a website? And what I came up with was action. When the user says, I want to do this, I want to see all the posts, I want to destroy a post, I want to see an individual post, I want to update something, right? I want to view my profile. That action is the core object to any web request, and I think it should be an object. And Rails has a request object, but it just passes it along all the way through to the controller to that action. I wanted to actually have a class that was instantiated and used for the sake of handling each particular action. For simplicity, I wanted to use rack as the protocol here. And I wanted to namespace my actions by their domain. So if you wanted to destroy a post, it would be in the namespace of posts, right? It wouldn't be destroy post, the word. It would be posts::destroy. Like I said, I wanted to have a class for every type. So my actions, if we're looking at the show action for posts, we've got this namespace. It's within my application, the blurb, right? I tried to stick very hard to gem styles application layout. In fact, my app is a gem. So inside blurb we have pages, because I named them pages earlier before I decided to call them actions, and I forgot to do this slide. Then there's the posts domain that says for posts I want to show, or other classes we could have here would be posts index, posts destroy. So what I'm showing here is that show could inherit from a find action, right? So when you run call, you can do a super, then you can grab a view for that post, and then render the view out and respond, right? So what's happening with that super, right? And I'll get to that in a sec. But what you could share between a show and a destroy is that they're both finders, right? And we've seen this with things like CanCan. The great thing about CanCan is that it manages your abilities, but the second best thing about CanCan is how it finds all your objects for you in your controllers. And so if you actually just had these find actions that just found objects for you, then you could share them as a class to inherit from. So here I'm getting into a little bit of white box territory, but this white box, I wrote it. So of course it's white box, it's part of my application, So my posts find action means that there is a post, and when you call, I'm going to parse the rack request and find the post based on the params for ID. So this is how you find a post, right? And now I can use that in both destroy and show to find posts. And this is normally what you would see in a controller's before filter, would be to find this stuff and set an instance variable. But instead, I have a superclass that actually has a post adder accessor that lets you access that post. Yeah, Scott?
Yeah, why do you inherit from find actions instead of including them?
To call super on call.
Oh,
because otherwise I wouldn't have a way to hook into the chain. Rails, because they have the request method on controllers, anybody can get to the request. So if I did something like that, if I had posts inherit from an action object that's just set at request, direct request.newEnv, then I could be mixing these in. And that's totally a valid way to do it too. It just depends on how much, what style you want to do. And we could also probably do this in a little bit of like a DCI style, where you can have a finder, and the finder could be instantiated with what kind of class you want to define, what the attribute in the params was. You mix it into your rack object, then you tell it to grab your thing, right? Then you proceed with calling methods on that object. So by actually implementing my own classes here, I was able to have so much more control over how I wanted to lay this stuff out and really dig my hands in and see what it would be like if you did it as a module instead, just like you were saying. Yep, talked about that. Okay, so I was going to move on to view. Were there any questions about action?
So the one question I have is you talk about action being the biggest overarching thing. And so I wonder when you discuss this application and the action like you're going to show or destroy or whatever it is, why begin your namespacing with the application page post?
Well, I begin it with the application because I'm following GEM project standards, right? Just so that this could be used in the context of some other application, especially if you're going to have lots of micro rack apps that are all mounted together. You want to do something like this. But the only reason I namespaced it under page here, and I meant to write that as action, was just to separate posts from like my posts collection or my posts model or my posts view.
That's so I'm getting confused. So page should be action.
Page should be action. Yeah, I'm sorry.
That was my question.
Yep. Yeah. And so, but I do think that it would be perfectly reasonable for you to not use posts : show. Instead, that could be show post, right? I think that's totally legitimate, especially because like if you want to be really restful, then you probably want to do something like posts : show, right? Because it's going to be more like REST and people will know where to find it. But most of the time you end up having at least a minority of your application deviating from REST to these special actions. And in those cases, it makes sense to name it something nice and specific and not really namespace it under some sort of overarching namespace. But you have the freedom to do that because after I put blurg : page, aka action, on the front, now this is just all of my actions, right? Mm-hmm. And they're only going to be actions over here. It's not like in a Rails app where if you make a product model, all of a sudden product is a reserved name everywhere in your application because you made a model for it, right? Now you can't use top-level product anywhere. And God forbid you mix in a gem called product, right? Then you're really screwed. So that's the main reason for the namespacing. I did kind of like throw up a little in my mouth when I started typing all these colons because I was like, why don't I just name them packages and call it blurg.page.posts and just go write Java and use Eclipse? So I was a little unhappy with that. And one thing I still haven't quite figured out in Ruby is trying to access objects that are within a parent's or parent of parent's scope without fully qualifying the scope. And so I still have to play around with that a little bit. Because it would be nice to be able to say from here, like, comments, and have it know that you want to blurg action comments, right? Be able to say comments : show. Because it would be nice to have the controllers be able to talk to each other without using the full qualified namespace. And I think you can do that, but I think I had some problems one time, and I'm kind of confused about it. But that's an easy thing to go and experiment with. And that comes back to the traditional MVC, like controllers talking to each other. One of the things I thought about here that would be really cool is, you know how when you try to create something, and then when it fails, you render the new action? I always thought that was so weird, because now you have to take any steps that the new action tried to do and then render it. Whereas what you could do in this case is just say page posts new.call env, right? Or slightly tweak the env. I think they call it slipstreaming sometimes, right? You kind of merge a few things into the environment and then you give it to this other action that implements this protocol. Now you can actually have controllers call other controllers methods when it needs to delegate,
I saw that in one of the node libraries at some point. It was that you could start your way through an action, and then like you could be like, you kind of give up. You're like, no, never mind. I'm not going.
Somebody else do it.
Somebody else, and then he'll just
Yeah.
kind of continue going through and match the next one.
Yeah, I definitely think there's some power there in delegating between actions. And I have no idea how I would do that with Action Controller because they're methods. You can't just call them. You can't just call them and pass the params in, right? You are the class. From the create method, you can call the new method and it'll run the code in new, and then you have to say render new instead of the current one. But it'd be nice to not have to do both of those, to just be able to do one thing and say, toss it, go to the other one. All right, so views. For views, I was very clear about how I wanted to do this, mostly because of how I've been working on them with Backbone. I wanted my views to be real Ruby objects. I wanted their job to be to take models, to ask them about their model's state, and then be able to render themselves somehow. So when I say view here, I want you to think presenter, because for the past year, year and a half, 2 years, people have been talking about presenters as being objects that take a model and then make them look nice for people to see. And then you pass the presenter to the Rails view to actually render it nicely. I wanted to make that what views actually were. And this is more in line with every other MVC framework in existence other than Rails, as far as I've seen. And I think Rails, they won a little bit, but it's because they look like PHP. I mean, views are pretty much PHP scripts. And if you've ever seen someone who did a lot of PHP and they came to Rails, they have the skinniest controllers. And then their views are all of their code, because that's how PHP works, right? I wanted to move away from that further and more towards a traditional framework. To go with the views are the templates. I wanted the template to be in the native language, so HTML, or maybe the native language is JSON, right? Whatever it is that the client is expecting, I want that language to be what the template represents. I want these to be dumb, like really, really, really dumb. And here I want you to think about Rails views, right? Because Rails views are really templates. We just put too much logic into them and we dig ourselves into a hole that way.
Now, are you thinking of these templates in terms of like partials and minute aspects of the view?
Whole stack, all the way from the smallest partial to the full layout, are going to be done with a view and a template working together. So here is I made a base class for myself. A main view has the following protocol. You call render on it, and it will give you whatever its native language is run in its own self as a context. So when you see render there, it's saying use my template with mustache and pass me to mustache as the template context. There's also a class method on the view that lets you set the template, and I made a little helper for myself here to find the appropriate mustache file. This is one of the things Rails does for you that's really nice, but I had to write here in a couple lines. So now that we have this view base class, what we can do is make a view for a post. So my post view has a post. The template file is called post. It extends Ruby's forwardable, which lets me set up delegators. So what I'm saying here is when you call title or body on the view, I want you to just call post.title and post.body. Rails shortens this to delegate, so they can say delegate title, comma, body, comma, to arrow post. So that's the same style as the forwardable and def delegators here. So in this case, it's kind of like what people see for presenters or decorators like Jeff Casimir's Draper, where it passes through the uninteresting features, or the ones that don't need translation. My constructor is really simple. Set the post. At the bottom here, I included a method that is actually doing some view work. When you ask for the date of a post in the context of a view, I want to take the created at timestamp, and I want to format it nicely with the strf time specification on the right there, which will say like, 2/14/2012, 8 p.m., something like that. So here's where I'm doing my, human translation of the data object into the presented object. So this is what a lot of presenters look like, but this is actually what views are supposed to be. The simplest one would simply delegate everything like method missing style to its underlying object, and you wouldn't really need it. And since that's a very common situation for simple stuff, Rails just does that for you by passing those instance variables through to your view and then having on your view just call the methods that you want. Sorry, yeah.
Why are you tying it to one template? Like, why don't you just make a view that can be rendered by, or just, view that can be rendered by multiple templates? I guess I'm thinking of it like a presenter where you can pass.
Right. So Scott was asking why I can't just have multiple templates that work with one view. I think that sounds really interesting and probably makes a lot of sense. Passing those views around, right? I think what would be the downside to that is that your calling context needs to know the view and the template that it wants to use. But a view should really be returning something in the native language when it renders itself. So I wanted my views to be able to say, okay, view, give me HTML for a post. So in this case, this would be like the blurg view HTML post, or post : HTML, right? And maybe they inherit from each other, but then they use a different template. Because you could do that pretty easily just by inheriting and then saying template file something else, right? Or you could have a view for the post and then have two parent views that use that view and use it with different templates, you know?
Yeah, so like the parent one kind of does the presenter stuff, and like the child views handle the template.
Yeah, although I don't see a need to separate the presentation logic from the templating, because I think those two can go together in the same way. For instance, here we've got date, right? It's doing presentation, and then date is exposed to the template library in the place that it should be, right?
Like in this case, what if you had date like on the index page, where you want to have all the posts and their dates right underneath it? Like,
yep.
Wouldn't you have to like duplicate that and like put that code in the index view as well?
Oh, so if I wanted to render dates in a similar way?
Yeah,
right. That's where like the acts as whatever sort of things come in. So if I could have like a dateable module that would ask for created as, right, or singled. I saw you laughing about that. So then once created at has been exposed, then a dateable view can look for the created at attribute, present it nicely, and say that here you go, dear template, this is date, right? I'm glad we're talking about being dateable on Valentine's Day. This is tremendously appropriate. So what that means is that the templates here become very, very dumb. So a post has a title and an H1. It has a small paragraph for the date right below it, and then there's a body div where the body is pasted in. So we're not doing any iteration here, and we're not doing any string interpolation, any management. And this template could be used for a different, this template could be used for a different view, like you were saying before, Scott, but also this view could be used for a different native language, like JSON, right? And I think that would be a great way to do template switching, to be able to say like HTML template, post, JSON template, post JSON, right? And then use two different templates but have the same object exposed. I think that sounds pretty awesome.
So how would you do that? Because that was going to be my question. How do you do a different representation of your data?
Well, you could you could take this post view and have it like, imagine you took this view exactly as it is, but you deleted the template file line. So now this view doesn't have an associated template, right? Now inside, make two internal classes, one called HTML and one called JSON. The HTML one has template file HTML. The JSON has template file JSON. They both inherit from this base class. So now view post talks about how to present a post, right? But then it has these two inner classes for the different formats associated with different templates that it might work with. That's just one implementation. You could do this a lot of different ways, I think. Like Rails is a respond to. You could have different modules that you mix in that might respond in different ways. So instead of just calling render, you might call render HTML or render JSON, and they could call different ones. I think what's the most interesting about what I found from building this stuff up from scratch is that I probably refactored this like 8 times. just coming with all different kinds of crazy ways that I could do it. I'm not showing you the best one. I'm just showing you the one that I kind of settled on. But I think having interchangeable parts like this means that you can do all kinds of different crazy stuff, and that's what's awesome about it.
So, is it back a slide where the template loading occurred? Yeah.
Yeah, my base class view, when you set the template file, it sets the template equal to a file that it reads. So you can call template file over and over and over again, and it'll just set template to something else, which is just an attribute. So you could keep calling, so you could subclass it and then call template file again and just swap its template, and then maybe change an attribute and kind of say, well, now this is my sparkly post, and the title is all sparkly, right? You could just, and you know, that template might have special classes on it.
So in this case, would you instead name this like mustache view or something like that?
Yeah, that would probably be appropriate here to call this mustache view. And that way they would be, the subviews could say, well, I'm a mustache view because I'm going to give a mustache template, right? But maybe maybe the base class here would, the render method could call the renderer, right? And then you could mix in different rendering modules into the different views. You know, you could split this apart a lot of different ways because really we're so close to raw Ruby here. I mean, the possibilities. I had so much trouble actually getting anything done because I just wanted to refactor it over and over again, which is why I didn't get a lot of my goals done because I was just focusing on some of these things. So, okay, so I want to talk about view composition because that was one of the key properties of classic MVC views is composition. I think this is something that Rails does pretty poorly. So what I created here was just a plain old view. I just happened to call it layout. It has an attribute called view, and that's going to be our subview that we're rendering within our layout. The template file is layout. We're delegating render and content to the view. And so when we initialize, we're setting that view as our local property, and then my layout looks like this. It just says welcome to Blurg, and then it has content. This is like the yield in Rails's layout. So that content is going to hit view. And actually, I think the render here is a typo. I don't think it should be delegating render because that would override its own. But by calling content, now you're calling view dot. Oh, I'm sorry. That's what's wrong here. Def delegator. I knew this was going to get me. This is def delegators, where title and body get delegated to post. And this is why they renamed this in Rails. Def delegator is saying take view's render and call it content in this state. So when you call the method content, you're calling view.render. That's that. I'm sorry. This is confusing. This is why they did it differently in Rails and call it delegates, because it reads a lot nicer. So when you call content here, content is a method on the layout view, and what it does is it calls view.render and returns that result. So what that means is I've created this nesting style where when I call content, I get my subviews content, right? Now because this is just a plain old view, it's not a special layout class, I could have another sub layout called admin layout that does the same thing with another template. Layout could call admin layout, which could call sub-admin layout, which could call Tuesday layout, which could call the post view, right? You can nest them as many times as you want. You could even have two views being mixed in. So for example, the master layout could have a sidebar view and a content view and a footer view and a header view. And those four views could all work together to make the page. The header view would have to know about who's logged in because it wants to put their name at the top. Sidebar view needs to know the context of this action. What are the routes involved? How deep am I in the breadcrumb to display the navigation? Something like that. The content view is just what you wanted for this request. And the footer might just do something simple like fill in the current year for the copyright. When you get these compositions, what I find gets really interesting are some of the crazy things that you could do now that you've delegated this work to 4 different objects. Because imagine if those 4 objects, the header, the sidebar, the content, and the footer, all had to make database or external API calls, right? You just thread them. right? You just render this view in something like Event Machine. You use a couple blocking gems that async on block, and now all of a sudden you can render all four at the same time, be calling all of your external dependencies, and then release your own reactor loop to somebody else who's working, but be able to multi-process these things super easy. If you have a view like this, how easy would caching be? Like, or the post view, for example. Caching on this would be like so easy, because the only thing that this view depends on, its dependencies are injected right in the initialize. Its cache key only depends on that post, because the template only is concerned by the post. This simplifies caching so much, and you can have cascaded caching kind of bubbling up your system. 37 Signals has been talking about Basecamp Next, and they've been talking about their crazy cascading caching system. And I kind of wonder if they're going to introduce some wacky way with Rails of the way that they're doing their views and stuff that have these nested cache keys that'll be similar to this. I hope so. But I just think that like doing caching with this would be really easy. Rack, actually, the real rack spec doesn't say that you need a string content at the end. It says you need something at the end that responds to each, that it can call over and over again to get the content. Imagine if your posts index file, your post index view, was calling an individual subview for every post that gets returned, and you're dealing with a service that returns you data over time. You can implement each on your post index view that does each view one at a time as the data comes in and yields it up to rack one at a time. So your entire processing pipeline is actually in all these layers of each calling each other and feeding data back to the client exactly as they become available. This is one of the hardest things that I think there are a bunch of, I think Aaron Patterson's working on this in Rails, trying to get it so that the rack layers can actually be pushing content as they're rendering it. But in this case, with this, completely contrived example that I have, it's really easy, right? Okay, so I know he's not here. I figured he wouldn't be here, but I recorded it. Dear Jeff Casimir, in March of 2011, we talked about Draper and presenters, and I told him that I'm just going to have to take a stab at it all by myself and figure out what I like about his and what I like about mine. And it turns out what I really wanted was just what everybody else in the programming world calls a view. I think we absolutely do views wrong in Rails. I think cells are a great start towards that. But Rails still treats views like PHP, and I really want to change that. All right, so last couple objects. Collection. I had this great dream of making a backbone-style collection, which is where the collection itself is an object that lets you add and remove and delete stuff. It really didn't go well, so I'm just going to skip over this. Model. I got to model and I was like, you know what? There are a lot of people working on this stuff, and it's pretty well encapsulated. And there's data mapper, there's SQL, there's Active Record, and there's a bunch more. And they're all working on this. And I think since it's divided far enough out, because like I said before with Model 2, the model is just what you need, right? You can use Rails without Active Record. You can just remove it from the frameworks list and get going. And that means that you can use SQL or Data Mapper in Rails, and I think they've done a good job here. And so I didn't really touch this section because I spent more time on views and templates than the routers and the actions. So I wanted to mention a couple of the frameworks that we see for web stuff. These are like white box frameworks, Sinatra, Padrino, Rails. These are all things that call your code for web, right? As far as libraries, they're a lot lower level. We have the HTTP router, we have Rack, we have Mustache, we have Data Mapper. These are all things that you can call to make a web service. I think the idea of object composition and composing lots of small libraries to get something done is very powerful. To say that the programmer themselves have control of the whole operation of that request and are then asking smaller library type objects to do the footwork for them, I think that's very powerful. And while frameworks can make a lot of choices for you, I think you get the most control, the most customization, and the most flexibility when you're doing object composition with black box style libraries. So questions. These are some of the things that I came away with at the end that were still questions in my mind. What are the pros and cons of white versus black box? White box frameworks like Rails make things really easy because they make decisions for you. The cons are that they're not that flexible if you want to use something else. I think there's a lot more things here, and I think sometimes we overlook some of the pros of these frameworks just when we see some of the cons. But I do think that some of the cons are worth really looking at and seeing if we can improve them. With Active Record, they extracted out Active Model for Rails 3. I think this is great. I think building more small libraries that Rails calls is a really powerful refactoring that I think will help us a ton in the Rails community. If we can pull the controller out, if we can pull the view out the way that we pulled Active Model out of Active Record, that would be awesome. I'm kind of sad that they did this to Active Record, because I think we would have got a lot more mileage out of doing this sort of refactoring to Action View, but it would have broken way more people's code, so I can see how that would be an issue. So the thing I want to end with is how can we make Rails more of a black box, or more of a composition of black box libraries? I know Rails 4, it's already in the works, but what are Rails 5 and Rails 6 and Rails 7 going to look like? At what point are we going to start really breaking out these chunks and making separate libraries out of Rails? And I think they're headed in the right direction with that. Okay, actual questions. So these are questions for me. Like I said, the code's all online here. You'll find it somewhat helpful because some of these examples are not directly from the code. They're from older versions. They're from pseudocode that I made up. But other than that, were there any more questions?
The question, how we can improve Rails makes me wonder, you have this dichotomy of convention over configuration. How do you still maintain the power of that, but then also, have all the configuration options that you want?
Yeah, I think the most important thing there are the protocols that we were talking about with black boxes. If we can define more, a few more, take some of the other objects in Rails and make simple protocols for them. If a view had a certain set of methods that it needed to implement, like cache key and content type, content length. If you implement those on view, maybe we need to have a couple more methods like that, but then maybe we can swap out view models, right? Or view libraries. But by default, Rails will come with Action View, and it's just one of those things that defaults in. It's like how they packaged CoffeeScript with it, but all you have to do is remove it from the gem file and you don't get it anymore. They did a great job letting people use different view languages and being able now in Rails 3 to chain them. So you can say .html, .erb, and you can keep. You've got like application.js.coffee.erb if you want to, right? You can keep chaining those on, and by having a really simple protocol for how those work to do the interpolation through different languages, they've been able to stack them, right? I think if you've got those protocols, then and you put a few simple ones in place, you'll be able to swap out these components. And I think by forcing that break to make them implement those protocols, by simplifying them, it may actually improve the code base, which would be nice.
So Rails essentially just go down to this, lightweight something that you can plug anything into? It's a really high level protocol maybe?
Well, I think Rails would be great as a really big web standard library for Ruby, and have a couple top level objects. Like I used rack URLMap to be my router. If you could just say, like there is the Rails : application that your application inherits from to be a Rails app. We've got that. We can use that, right? That has a lot of exposed configuration. But it would be nice if we could use a different application object at that point, but then still use things like Action Controller or Action View. Be able to swap and plug and play these different components of the system. And then Rails becomes this big standard library of all the components that you could ever want. But you could also go and grab some other gem and swap it, right? Or write your own. Yeah, or write your own in Vendor that that is your own view that you needed for this project because you are the only guy in the world that exports some of your views to this really crazy content type for like satellites or something, right? And now you've got your own views that make way more sense for satellites where there might be a lot of more packet loss or something like that, right? You've got these special views that work different from everybody else's but work better for you.
But if you make it so generalized, isn't it maybe just worth to go off and not use Rails, just write something for satellite? You know, that specific use
Yeah,
case
no,
rather than have this.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely that question of,
How far
well,
is
how far do you take it
Yeah,
before
yeah.
Rails is worthless,
Yeah.
right? And one of the best things about Rails is all of the conventions that come with it.
Right.
And I think that's still incredibly powerful and important. And I would just like to see some of the core components be something that we can manipulate easier day to day.
So like active model for everything, active model for.
Yeah, because you can write your own class that
Right.
implements active model and then
Right.
use it with Rails.
Right.
And use it with Rails forms, which is great. All those great forms helpers that all of a sudden you can use all the error stuff. You can use text fields, automatically populate from attributes. It's all great. And then you can make whatever persistence store that maybe you wrote your own, you've got your model for it, and it works with all the Rails forms. They've defined a protocol for that, and that's what allowed them to extract active model. I want to see that same pattern through a lot of the other components in Rails.
One thing, I went to a talk from the guy that's like the CTO at Guild Group now. They're like a Flash Guild kind of website. They have like a huge traffic force and stuff. And they used to be on Rails, and then they moved to a like service-based Java custom setup that they built. And they were talking about how they could build the pages. Like the pages are all like individualized for you, but they're kind of composed of all these different services. And they have these really tight SLAs so that each kind of component, like if it doesn't render in the right amount of time, it just doesn't show up on the page for that time.
Yeah, that's very Amazon style.
It's very Amazon style. And so after he was kind of giving that talk, and he was like, well, you know, we had to do it in Java because like I'm a Java guy and I knew how to do it in that, and like it would have been cool to do it in Rails, but I just never seen it before. It's basically like one part of the talk. And so as I was looking at what you were saying in terms of like the views being like, I mean, that's kind of what you're doing. Is you're building like these. You're building. Like, you could build little services in this kind of framework that would have like an SLA.
Yeah, the view could,
Yeah.
that view, it doesn't need to take HTML and take data and turn it into HTML, or take a template and turn it into HTML with some data. It could make an API call.
Yeah.
Really easy to render itself, right? And and that's why I think things like Event Machine would be a nice framework for this kind of setup, because you could have these asynchronous building components, right? And you could be running a cluster of these different things. You could have one system, and its entire job is to render header bars, you know,
Yeah.
just like you're saying.
And that's what they said. That's
Right.
what they said they went to.
And then you
went
just
to
have your
couple
giant
of
composer that just grabs all the views that it needs and slams them all together into its master template as quickly as it can, or it fails, right? Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's where, like, at some point you got to write your own system when you want to do something extreme in an extremely particular fashion. And I'd like to see, I mean, like I said, I'd like to see Rails breaking and moving more towards this way, but I'd also like to see more libraries coming from the bottom up. We have things like Mustache and HTTP Router that take and do these components. But, and Mustache's Ruby implementation is very similar to the Vue sort of library. But there aren't a lot of Vue libraries out there. There are a lot of templating languages, but I want to see more views, or maybe a helper on top of Rack that can do some of this parameter and cache manipulation stuff for actions, or calling other actions, or maybe a, yeah, as far there.
Yeah, I think the reason we don't see that is because it is like Rails is so tied, action controller and action view are so tied together to the router that you can't reasonably pull it out. I mean, maybe it's
And
easier now, but
that's so sad to me too, because I feel like one of the cleanest, simplest protocols is from the router to the controller to the view. Like the view takes the controller as a context, and I've actually instantiated my own action views from my own objects, and they're actually pretty simple. And it's too bad that that it's a little difficult to swap them around, although it is possible. I mean, that's what cells are, right? But the router to controller interface is pretty easy too, because it's passing that request through. We just don't have the ability to tweak that and play with it. I think, this is a total guess here, but I thought there was a way in the Rails router that you could actually specify the target of a route to be an object that is rack-like, or like a rack object.
Yeah, I think you can.
So that would be a neat way to do it. But then you lose all the Rails stuff for controllers. You'd have to make your, your authentication mechanism a rack middleware, which most of them are anyways. All right, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Nick.